I used to believe weddings were about beginnings, new chapters, promises spoken out loud so the universe could hear them. I built my entire life around that belief, brick by brick, contract by contract, smiling through exhaustion because I thought love multiplied when you shared it. I was wrong. Sometimes love is just a blueprint someone else studies so they can steal the building when you're not looking. My name is Mara Ellison, and the first thing my husband ever stole from me wasn't money or clients. It was my certainty. I remember the exact morning it started to crack. The sunlight was slanting through the kitchen window, catching dust motes in the air like glitter, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was. I was standing barefoot on the tile, coffee cooling in my hand, flipping through seating charts for a vineyard wedding scheduled 6 weeks out. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Callie, one of my longtime florists. "Hey Mara, just wanted to double check. Are we still working together on the Renshaw wedding? I got an email from Evan's company asking for my availability." Evan's company. I stared at the words until they blurred, my pulse ticking in my ears. Evan was my husband. Evan, who had sworn up and down that leaving his corporate marketing job was just about finding himself. Evan, who said he wanted to support me, learn the business, maybe help with admin if I ever needed it. Evan, who had sat across from me at this very counter, nodding along while I explained how fragile vendor trust was, how relationships were everything in this industry. I typed back slowly, my fingers stiff. "I'm the planner on that wedding." What company did the email come from? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Ever After Collective. The mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the floor, coffee splashing up my calves. I didn't feel it. Ever After Collective was the name Evan had tossed around casually a few weeks earlier, like a thought that hadn't fully formed. I'd assumed it was just that, a name, a fantasy. I sank into the chair, my chest tight, and pulled up my email. There it was. A forwarded message from the bride, time-stamped 2 days earlier, buried under invoices and timelines. "Hi Mara, Evan from Ever After Collective reached out and said he's taking over coordination moving forward. Just wanted to confirm since he said you're stepping back?" Stepping back. I could hear Evan in my head, his easy smile, the way he always framed things as if they were already decided, and I was just catching up. My hands were shaking as I scrolled. Another email, and another. Different clients, similar wording, confusion, assumptions planted like landmines. I stood up so fast the chair scraped loudly across the floor. "Evan," I called, my voice sharper than I intended. He was in the home office, the one that used to be my overflow workspace, until he'd slowly taken it over with his vision boards and branded notebooks. He leaned in the doorway, relaxed, coffee in hand, like this was any other morning. "Hey, you okay?" That sounded dramatic. I held up my phone. "Why are my clients getting emails from your company?" He didn't even flinch. That was the first sign I was already behind. "I was going to tell you," he said smoothly. "It just happened faster than I expected." What happened faster? My voice felt distant to my own ears. The demand. Vendors started reaching out once they heard I was launching. Word spreads fast in this industry. He shrugged, like it was flattering, inevitable. "No," I said. "They reached out because they already work with me, because I introduced you, because you sat at my table and listened while I built this." He sighed, setting his mug down, adopting that tone he used when he thought I was being emotional. "Mara, you don't own people or relationships. I'm just offering an alternative." "Using my contracts," I snapped. "My clients." He smiled then, small and tight. "Actually, most of them signed with you before we were married. Different entity. Different business." The room felt like it tilted. I thought of the clauses I'd insisted on, the legal language I'd paid a small fortune to have drafted because I believed in protecting what I built. Non-compete agreements, vendor exclusivity terms, client confirmation timestamps. I'd done everything right, and yet here he was, standing in my space, acting like the ground beneath my feet was negotiable. "You can't do this," I said, my throat burning. He met my gaze, something cold flickering behind his eyes. "I already am." That was the moment I realized my marriage wasn't ending. It was already over. What I was watching was the demolition phase. The weeks that followed blurred into a constant low-grade panic, the kind that sits in your chest and hums even when you're trying to sleep. Vendors called me quietly, apologetically. Some confessed Evan had implied I was overwhelmed, unreliable, stepping away to focus on personal matters. Clients emailed asking for clarification, their trust wobbling. Every message felt like another thread being pulled loose. At night, Evan moved through the house like a guest who had overstayed his welcome but refused to leave. He took calls in hushed tones, laptop angled away from me, calendar suddenly full. When I confronted him again, he accused me of being paranoid, of trying to stifle his ambition. "You should be proud of me," he said one evening, loosening his tie, not looking at me. "We're in the same industry. We can dominate together." "You're undercutting me," I said. "That's not domination, that's theft." He laughed softly. "It's competition." I stopped arguing after that, not because I agreed, but because something inside me went very still. Rage, when it burns too long, eventually crystallizes into clarity. I pulled every contract I'd ever signed, printed emails, time-stamped invoices. I sat at my desk until dawn, surrounded by paper, my life reduced to evidence. The more I organized, the calmer I became. Evan had underestimated one thing. I didn't just plan weddings. I planned for disaster. The final confirmation came from a client named Brielle, her voice trembling on the phone. "Mara, he said if I didn't switch to his company, the vendors might drop out. Is that true?" "No," I said, and meant it, "and I can prove it." When I hung up, I opened my laptop and drafted a single document, a timeline. Every client Evan had contacted, every vendor he'd approached, every clause he'd violated. I sent it to my attorney, a woman named Lenora Pike who specialized in business disputes and had once told me, "People only get bold when they think you won't fight back." Her reply came an hour later. "He's in breach. Multiple counts, and he's sloppy." I stared at the screen, a slow smile spreading across my face for the first time in weeks. Sloppy was good. Sloppy meant visible. The industry awards gala invitation arrived the next day, thick cream paper, gold embossing catching the light. Ever After Collective, nominee for Rising Star Wedding Planning Firm. Evan's name printed proudly beneath it. I traced the letters with my finger, my reflection warped in the glossy surface. He thought he'd won. He thought the story was already written. He didn't know that every vendor he'd stepped on, every client he'd confused, every lie he'd told had been quietly lining up behind me. He didn't know that the contracts he'd mocked were about to become a noose. As I slipped the invitation back into its envelope, my hands were steady. The panic was gone, replaced by something sharper, cleaner. Beginnings, I realized, don't always look like white dresses and open aisles. Sometimes they look like a stage, bright lights, and a man about to be exposed in front of everyone he tried to impress. The night after the nomination went public, Evan came home buzzing with a kind of energy I hadn't seen since our wedding day. Pacing the living room, phone glued to his ear, laughing too loudly, already rehearsing gratitude speeches for people who didn't know they were about to turn on him. I watched from the kitchen doorway. silent, cataloging the details the way I always did under pressure. The loosened tie, the confident posture, the way he spoke as if the future had already bent to accommodate him. And I felt a strange detachment settle over me, as if I were no longer his wife, but the planner of an elaborate event whose outcome only I truly understood. When he finally noticed me, he grinned and said my name like it was an afterthought, telling me the gala would be huge exposure, that this was proof he'd been right to branch out, that maybe one day I'd even thank him for forcing me to level up. And I nodded, soft, agreeable, because the version of me who needed to argue had already been buried under weeks of preparation. That night, once he fell asleep, I opened my laptop and sent a series of carefully worded emails, not accusations, not threats, just confirmations, attaching contracts vendors had signed with my company first, timestamps, clauses highlighted in clean, neutral yellow, asking them to verify their original commitments in writing from my legal records. And one by one, replies came in, hesitant at first, then firmer. People apologizing, admitting they'd felt pressured. Admitting Evan had implied consequences that were never real, and with each message my chest loosened, the knot slowly untying itself as I realized I wasn't standing alone on the edge of this cliff after all. Over the next few days, I met with Lenora in her glass-walled office, the city humming below us, and she laid it out plainly that Evan's non-compete violations weren't just technicalities, that he had solicited clients under false pretenses, interfered with existing contracts, misrepresented my business status, and that if this went to court, it would be devastating for him, but that timing mattered. That sometimes the most effective justice wasn't immediate, but strategic. And when she mentioned the awards gala again, her eyebrow lifting slightly, I understood exactly what she was suggesting without her needing to say it. The gala was the industry's annual spectacle, a night where reputations were cemented in front of press, peers, and potential clients, where applause could translate directly into bookings. And Evan had worked himself into a frenzy preparing, sending out invites, nudging vendors to attend, eager to be seen as the next big thing, never suspecting that the same people he'd leaned on would become witnesses. I spent those days quietly coordinating, not weddings, but conversations, meeting vendors for coffee, listening more than I spoke, letting them vent about feeling used, about being put in awkward positions, about being told I was unstable or stepping away. And when I finally slid copies of their own contracts across the table, pointing to the clauses Evan had violated, watching realization dawn on their faces, something shifted, a collective indignation replacing their earlier confusion. By the time the gala arrived, my phone was full of unread messages from Evan, reminders about attire, seating, whether I planned to show up and be supportive, and I didn't respond until the afternoon of the event, sending a single text that said I wouldn't miss it for the world. Walking into the hotel ballroom that evening felt surreal, the chandeliers blazing overhead, the air thick with perfume and anticipation, and I could feel eyes on me as I moved through the crowd, people whispering, some sympathetic, some curious, most unaware of the undercurrent pulling tight beneath the polished surface. Evan spotted me almost immediately, his smile flashing with relief, pulling me into a brief, performative embrace, telling anyone nearby how proud he was that we could still support each other professionally. And I let him believe it, letting him guide me to a table near the front, where several vendors were already seated, their expressions carefully neutral. As the evening progressed, awards announced, applause rising and falling, my heart beat steadily, not with nerves, but with certainty, because every piece was in place, every document forwarded, every client prepared, And when Evan's category was finally announced, the room buzzing with excitement, his name projected in elegant font on the massive screen, I saw the flicker of triumph cross his face as he stood, adjusting his jacket, ready to bask in the validation he thought he'd earned. That was when Callie stood up first, her voice clear, carrying across the sudden hush, stating calmly that she could not, in good conscience, support a nomination built on stolen contracts and misrepresentation. And before anyone could react, another vendor rose, then another, each one naming specific breaches, specific conversations, each one confirming publicly that their original agreements had been with my company, not his. And the room erupted into murmurs as Evan froze, his smile collapsing, his gaze darting toward me with dawning horror. I stayed seated, hands folded in my lap, watching as the narrative he'd so carefully constructed unraveled in real time, watching clients stand to echo the same story, filing formal complaints through the association's process, even as the host tried desperately to regain control of the room. And when the committee chair finally stepped forward, face tight, announcing that the nomination was being withdrawn pending investigation. The applause that followed was not celebratory but decisive, the sound of a verdict delivered without a courtroom. Evan didn't look at me as he sank back into his chair, his face pale, his future imploding under the weight of his own shortcuts, and as security quietly escorted him out amid flashing cameras and whispered questions, I felt a release so profound it almost brought me to tears, not because I'd won, but because the truth, once given a stage, had done exactly what it always does. When the ballroom finally settled, people approached me softly, offering support, apologies, gratitude for standing up for integrity in an industry built on trust, and I realized that the business he'd tried to steal had grown beyond him, beyond even me, into something resilient enough to withstand betrayal. Later that night, alone in my car, heels kicked off, city lights streaking past, I let myself breathe, deeply, fully, knowing that the marriage was truly over now, publicly, irrevocably, and that tomorrow would bring lawyers and logistics and rebuilding, but also something lighter, something honest. Because what Evan never understood was that weddings taught me how to plan for endings just as well as beginnings, and this ending, brutal and bright under the chandeliers, had given me my life back. The morning after the gala, I woke before sunrise with the echo of applause still ringing in my ears. Not the loud kind meant for winners, but the heavy, final sound of a door closing. And for the first time in months, my chest didn't feel tight with dread, but open with resolve. My phone was already buzzing. Messages stacked on messages, reporters requesting comments, vendors checking in, clients expressing relief that the truth had finally surfaced, and mixed among them were Evan's calls, missed and unanswered, his name lighting up the screen like a ghost I refused to acknowledge. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the look on his face when the nomination was pulled. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with clarity, because that moment wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation, about the world finally seeing what I had lived through quietly while he built himself on my work. By mid-morning, Lenora arrived at my office with coffee and a smile, spreading documents across my desk. Formal complaints filed overnight by clients, written statements from vendors, and an official notice from the Industry Association confirming Evan's suspension pending a full ethics investigation. And as she spoke, explaining timelines and likely outcomes, her voice steady and precise, I felt grounded, anchored again in the language of contracts and facts, rather than whispers and manipulation. Evan finally showed up just after noon, unannounced, his confidence stripped away, eyes bloodshot, suit wrinkled, standing in my doorway like a stranger who'd lost his way. And when he started talking, words tumbling over each other, blaming misunderstandings, claiming betrayal, insisting he'd only done what he thought was fair, I listened without interrupting, noticing how every sentence centered himself, his fear, his embarrassment, never once acknowledging the damage he'd caused. When he finally stopped, waiting for me to respond, I told him calmly that our lawyers would handle everything from now on, that he was not to contact my clients, vendors, or staff again, and that the marriage was over. Not because of the business alone, but because he'd chosen ambition over integrity long before I ever noticed. And as he left, shoulders slumped, I realized there was nothing left to grieve. The weeks that followed were relentless but clean, legal proceedings moving swiftly as evidence piled up, the non-compete violations undeniable, the association issuing a public statement condemning unethical practices, and Evans' company quietly dissolving as vendors withdrew en masse, unwilling to risk their reputations on someone already branded untrustworthy. I focused on rebuilding, meeting with clients to reassure them, renegotiating timelines, leaning on the team who had stayed loyal even when rumors threatened to fracture everything. And with each successful project, each thank you note, each recommendation passed along, my confidence returned, not as bravado, but as something sturdier, earned through survival. One afternoon, as I stood in the newly renovated office space, sunlight spilling across polished floors, I caught my reflection in the glass, recognizing the woman staring back at me not as someone scorned or wronged, but as someone sharpened by the fire she didn't start, but refused to be consumed by. The final resolution came quietly, a signed settlement delivered by courier, Evan agreeing to damages, restrictions, and a permanent injunction barring him from operating within the industry. And as I signed my name, the pen steady in my hand, I felt a sense of completion settle in. Not triumphant, not bitter, just done. Months later, at the same awards gala the following year, I attended again. Not as a nominee chasing validation, but as a respected figure invited to speak on ethical collaboration. And as I looked out at the familiar faces, vendors who'd stood with me, clients who'd trusted me, I understood that what I'd built could never truly be stolen, because it wasn't just contracts and contacts, it was trust, earned slowly, defended fiercely. When the applause came this time, it was warm, genuine, and I accepted it with gratitude, knowing that my life, my work, and my voice were finally aligned. I walked out into the night afterward, city air cool against my skin, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I wasn't looking back or bracing for impact. I was simply moving forward, whole, unburdened, and certain that the future I was planning now belonged entirely to me.
You've just stepped into her revenge side, where every wound finds its justice, and every silence ends with truth. If her story struck a chord, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. Another secret waits in the next video. See how her revenge begins.